Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that commentary and context. It was, with your permission, a chance to maybe say slightly more than normal because of some of the unique circumstances that we're facing, and then allow due time for questions and accountability. And as you said in your introduction, I thought it was prudent to see this today as part of a theme from moving from fighting the virus to fighting crime and how we can evidence what we're doing. In terms of the narrative, which is partly in the report, which obviously will be published, but partly sort of encompassing some of the broader issues that between the two of us respecting our institutional positions we have to wrestle with, I thought it was a chance to quickly update on the crime position, picking up some of the themes you've just mentioned, some of our work to tackle criminality, but then also some contemporary discussion about how we're adjusting our response to COVID, the issue of gatherings, and then at the end, a quick run through some emerging pressures around the budget and the Brexit plan going forwards. I think the crime one is really interesting, and I think it's worth noting for any members of the public that are zooming in that the narrative in front of you is slightly behind real time. And it's just to clarify to people that that's because of the rules that we have about how we have to present verified figures in the public domain, so that what we'll talk about today largely will reflect the end of the business year at the end of March, but perhaps some of the questions that may come from members will pull us into closer to the here and now, and we don't want to send out mixed messages because of the framework we have to work in. But you'll see that if you take a long-term view, crime has been falling since the start of the current recording regime over the 2 decades, but in the last few years, reflecting the trend in other parts of the UK, the crime levels are rising. You will also be aware, Chair, that we operate sometimes for comparative purposes against a number of similar organisations in GB to help us make sense of what good looks like, and that our crime levels per thousand population still remain at the lower range when you compare the averages in that most similar group, which tends to cover some of the larger conurbations in GB. Quite rightly, you referenced the rise in domestic abuse, and I think that's one of the sort of conundrums of crime fighting and policing, that maybe like hate crime as well, what is success? Because sometimes we will worry when crime levels go up, but equally for some personal crime, it's also a reflection of confidence that people will step forward and ask the police for help in times of violence. And I think it's about understanding really what the true level of crime in that space is. But domestic abuse is important in its own right, because clearly at the top end, it results in murder. It can ruin lives and wreck families. And it's one of my personal top priorities in my tenure as chief, but also organisationally something we take really seriously. I think when you see the domestic abuse position that's gone up this year in the figures we presented by 15%, it's also worth remembering, if we're looking about making the community as a whole safe and feel safer, roughly 1 in 6 of the crimes reported to us, which now rest at just over 100,000 for the total of the year, are related to that type of behaviour. Similarly, we've seen rises in harassment, which sometimes, again, are related to domestic abuse situations. But also, it's not to overlook the fact that one of the things that's driven crime levels up is more enforcement against the misuse of drugs, either through possession or through those that supply drugs to our communities. And that has to be a good thing, although the hidden balance is that because the way the counting rules work and the way we record it, police enforcement puts pressure into the figures. I think the balance is also not looking at just what we're doing in time to reduce crime, actually, but also our effectiveness of bringing people to book when they've committed crimes. You'll see in the report that broadly over the year that our detection or outcome levels have remained stable, just shy of 1 in 3 crimes are meeting that sort of resolution. And that's pretty strong performance when you consider comparative forces and other parts of GB. One of the things I'm personally pleased about, though, is to see a rise in our outcome rates for domestic violence with injury, which are now over 30% for the first time. I still think there's far more we can do in that space, because, as I've said more than once, I think that's the one crime who's done it. We can perhaps make more use of body-worn video and victimless prosecutions to bring the full force of the law to bear on people that prey on individuals in their home. I think the other thing we've been doing in that space, just to reassure people, is where you get that crossover between looking backwards in the here and now, is during the COVID period, and we'll hear from probably Alan later about his work as the Gold Commander. We have launched a manhunt for now 200 nearly of our most wanted and dangerous people, and we've arrested 100 of them so far. And the bulk of those actually have been people that we wanted for domestic abuse crime. The other thing that's not fully manifest in the figures and does bring us up to date is that while sometimes we talk about volumes, we're not sort of overlooking our determination to be relentless in our pursuit of organised crime in many sorts of ways. History has told us about the horrible effect that things such as the Essex trafficking investigation can have on lives. But over the last few days, we have seen real momentum in our fight against paramilitary crime through the task force and also organised crime in the general sense. I'm really pleased to be able to update board members that overnight we have seen a really significant seizure of cannabis in a joint operation with the National Crime Agency. Mindful you had Lynn Owens here last month. £12 million we estimate has been recovered and 3 people have been arrested, and that inquiry is quite fast-paced and ongoing. We've also seen in the last few days significant gains in terms of seizing a large cannabis farm, interrupting the flow of cocaine into the south of the country, and also a huge operation with the Revenue and Customs colleagues, which has dented organised crime in the border region when you've seen widely reported seizure of illicit fuel and tobacco. So that's not to say job done, but it reflects some of the determination that Mark and I have and colleagues to keep forward in that front foot approach to tackling organised crime that can harm communities. Clearly, one of the most contemporary issues that you probably expect some commentary on is what we're doing in the COVID space. And as we've said probably in other times, this is almost like policing a moving target. As the restrictions change, as the risk of incidence of disease changes, we've got to try and stay in tempo with that, because Alan's been quite resolute from the start that our approach has been about supporting the health endeavour, about getting a mandate from health colleagues about how our policing style supports suppression of the virus, whilst enabling people to go about as far as they can their daily lives as more restrictions are lifted. One of the things we're now doing is Alan is leading, and I've said more than once, I think he's done a fantastic job as our Gold Commander at wrestling all sorts of things that are in the public domain behind the scenes. But it's now leading on what we're describing as our recovery plan. So that consistent with rules and guidance around safe workspace, how do we reintroduce people back to daily business? How do we optimize some of the gains that we've made? So, for example, the assets we brought to bear through over 1,200 laptops to enable mobile working, so we continue business behind the scenes. And also a key step forward in terms of how we assure that within the workplace we're managing a safe space for people to come to work, both balancing our duties to reduce the risk of the virus, but also my duty under health and safety legislation to reduce the risk of exposure to the virus. A key step forwards will be, I'm pleased to announce, the resumption, if you like, of normal service, inverted commas, for neighbourhood policing. We did have to divert some officers away from their normal jobs to support the 12-hour shifts, and particularly the enforcement of travel restrictions at the height of the virus. And after a lot of thought and deliberation, Alan, and I encourage this, has now decided the time is right to put neighbourhood policing, if you like, back to normal, and you'll see that soon. Clearly, there's been a lot of interest in enforcement, which has tended to tail off over recent days and weeks. We've now issued 730 fixed penalty notices for breaches of the restrictions, balanced off against 400 community resolution notices. So we're trying to be proportionate in what we have to remember is our 4 E's approach. It's fair to say, in terms of travel restrictions, that step back to the 3 E's largely. So where we will engage, we'll explain, and we'll encourage. The new sort of kid on the block, as it were, in terms of policing challenges is, as you referenced, Chair, in the start, is clearly how we sensibly police large gatherings within the spirit of restrictions, but also recognising, although today is probably, I'm told, a bit more like business as usual weather for Northern Ireland, but the hot weather and how people have wanted to get outside after a long period of lockdown. There are some practicalities we've had to wrestle with in terms of actually, even in somewhere as clear as Crawfordsburn, what is a sensible and appropriate policing response to dispersing young people there. I myself have seen efforts recently to make sure there's an increased presence on the rail network so that we can support Translic in enforcement of bylaws and safe practice. And obviously, I'm pleased, Chair, that you were able to acknowledge the efforts of an officer who was, as you say, not only injured, stayed at work and then carried out CPR the same night. And I think that's relevant, not just in terms of her determination and all her values in terms of what we see as the best in policing, but you're probably aware that, like yourself, I've issued some comments this morning where we're saying we have been, as an organisation, appalled to see the events of a law enforcement officer in the US and how we couldn't condone behaviour like that. But equally, a message to people that if you need to protest, to do that responsibly. We saw events yesterday in Belfast where there was a large gathering where people are quite rightly concerned, frustrated, all sorts of emotions about how things have played out in the US. But as you say, I'm confident that actually we have, without being complacent, world-beating oversight. We've often advised, ironically, the US about the lessons learned in our journey from many years of experience of policing protests and other problems, about the oversight that this board brings, the Ombudsman, the Department of Justice, and also the public themselves in helping us hold to account. We are, I've seen, since my start here, an organisation that does really enshrine the human rights approach in a way I've not seen it's like in any professional sense that I've had in other parts of the UK, and that's something we should be really proud of alongside our work actually to preserve an ethical and values-based approach to policing, and doubtless there'll be some commentary on that later. But policing is a global endeavour, and clearly the events in the US will raise a number of questions about trust and legitimacy going forwards. We have been asked questions about our approach to yesterday, but I think we need to also ask ourselves as a society and a community, what do people want from us and what was an acceptable outcome to yesterday? Because it's easy to get emotive about a response to the restrictions on gatherings, but remembering also that was largely a peaceful protest. There were no arrests made, and so what would be proportionate in terms of our response to then conduct a post-event investigation, or indeed seek to disperse that investigation, that protest, when ironically it was about an outcry in relation to police use of force and brutality. So we had to, as ever, balance a number of competing considerations when we supported the organisers yesterday, who I don't think frankly expected as many people to turn up. We did have dialogue. We were able to sort of facilitate something that it's, we all cherish, that opportunity to cry out when something offends us. And we're going to work with the organisers again in relation to the protest that's now planned for Saturday. Moving forwards, in terms of some of the other things I think are really relevant, aside from this, what will doubtless be an ongoing debate about how we police gatherings of people, not just over the weekend, but we project forwards into July and some of the celebrations we will anticipate to see there. I applaud the comments from the Orange Order about sort of celebrate from your doorstep, but that will maintain that the policing challenge for us, not knowing fully yet how the virus may spread or decline, and also how restrictions will enable normal life and people to go about things that they would traditionally do here. I think there's some things I would encourage further debate on as we step forward, because the Hadfield Bar issue, which has been widely reported in the media, is but one of a number of things that Alan and colleagues have had to deal with in the last 2 months that probably remind us that our licensing laws are probably archaic, not fit for purpose. So I would encourage the debate, which I know is now being held by the Department of Communities, about making sure that licensing laws are enforceable but also keep pace with the modern world. And similarly, I've worked closely with the Ministry of Justice and ACC Mark McEwen and other colleagues across the criminal justice sector to step up the normal pace of the Criminal Justice Board and the oversight of justice, to make sure that during this unique period we've been able to adapt, we've been able to modernise, speedier, frankly, than we may well have done in other times, some process within the criminal justice space, but I don't want to lose that momentum. And we do realise we have an emerging issue about the amount of backlog of cases where they have not yet had a court appearance. And clearly, whether you're a victim, an individual accused of a crime, or a witness, we need quick resolution to that problem. Finally, before I sort of close for questions, I think it's a nod to two other issues that I think it's worthwhile to pay some due regard to. The first is Brexit. Sometimes, given all the other events we've been wrestling with, it's easy to forget that the clock is ticking. The first thing I'd like to do in that space is offer my thanks to the work that Tim Mayers has been doing, who has, amongst other people, sort of held the ring on this difficult issue for some time. He's held in high regard by other partners, by the sort of intellect and insight he's brought on our behalf to this issue. And obviously, as you're aware, Tim is leaving us shortly to take up a new role in Police Scotland, and we will be appointing a new senior lead in a few days to take forward that issue. But clearly Brexit needs to remain on our alert list, as we're not fully sure yet the reaction to proposals that have been made by the government. But actually, back to earlier comments, while sometimes we think of protest and officers on the streets, I think we also need to give due regard to the potential here, which is well evidenced in history, of serious and organised crime groups adapting to any differences in the opportunity to make money through tariff changes and the ease of moving goods and other contrabands around the country. The final thing I think to alert colleagues to on the board is that it would be remiss of me not to advise you of our concern about emerging pressures in the budget. You'll be aware about the unique way that we are funded here, where we have to annually sort of define a budget within a relatively short period of time and then begin to develop spending plans that mean we have to then spend all that money within realistically a few months, because the way often our procurement process is run. So Mark and I and the team have been wrestling with that challenge. We're mindful of our ambition to grow the organisation, which has to be balanced off against other concerns in the public sector. But we are now concerned that we have already spent in our projections up to £17 million in the year coming forwards in our fight against COVID, and that we're not now assured that all those costs will be recovered. So inevitably, we can see that there will be some expectation that the money we spend, for example, on personal protective equipment to keep officers and staff safe in a whole variety of settings has been well justified. But we've also spent other lines, for example, overtime, which will put some jeopardy to our plans that we've presented previously to you. We estimate at the moment a shortfall of in and around £8 million, and therefore I've asked Mark to lead some work about where we may have to adjust lines of spend, either in non-pay costs such as fleet renewal, back office services, which always sometimes is easy to forget actually affects frontline delivery, or indeed the headcount of officers and staff across the organisation, where we may have to suspend or slow down recruitment. So I've gone through quite a lot there, Chair, today with your sort of permission, but I'm conscious as well that members will want to ask myself and the team questions about some of the issues in the report and some wider issues of concern too.